Beyond Resilience is a series of curated conversations created by Firelight.
Beyond Resilience does a lot to keep people connected and keep people talking about films or talking about issues, connecting our filmmakers and other filmmakers together.
We wanted to create a space where our community, that is BIPOC documentary filmmakers, could lead a conversation.
We have to do a better job of knowing that films aren't just what we can physically see on the screen. It's about the people that put in the blood, sweat, and tears behind the scenes.
Knowing that what you're so passionate about, someone looks at as unmarketable or niche. Who's the audience for this? Who's going to care about this, right? And those simple things that people say are like daggers to you.
I think that is the part of the violence of the model minority shit, you know, that it like shaves away our history of resistance, of rebellion, of ferocity.
We have always resisted. We have always fought back in many different forms.
It's an evolving form. You have to evolve or not you will stagnate.
You have to have intention to change, and you have to understand that you're not changing to try to give anybody a gift, but you're changing so that you can do your job better.
What we're asking for is just proportional access, proportional resources, proportional marketing money, so that it does actually meet its mission, so that it does actually lean into the diversity of perspectives.
I hope that Beyond Resilience will keep its edge, will keep pushing the boundaries of the conversations that we need to have, and will keep growing its audiences, pulling in new people from the industry, outside the industry. It continues to be a space where people can have a BIPOC creator-led conversation. That is what it's about. Welcome, everyone. My name is Marcia Smith. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the co-founder and president of Firelight Media. I'm a Black woman with a medium-sized afro with blue glasses and a very nice blue and brown silk scarf around my neck. I want to first highlight that there are closed captions available for this event. To activate the closed captions, please select the CC button on your YouTube window. Thank you to Ronnie Zavosky for closed captioning services and my friend Andrea Lust for your ASL interpretation services. Thank you all for joining us today. This is our first Beyond Resilience event of 2023, entitled The Future of Film Programming. I'd like to start today with a land acknowledgement to raise awareness of Indigenous presence and land rights, and to stand in solidarity with Indigenous people. I am in Harlem on the land of the Munsee Lenape people. I encourage you all to make your own land acknowledgement in the chat. Our moderator will drop a link to resources that will help you discover whose ancestral lands you live on. For those of you who may not know, Firelight Media is a 22-year-old nonprofit organization, a premier destination for nonfiction filmmakers of color. We support filmmakers through programs like our flagship documentary lab, an 18-month fellowship. We provide grant support through programs like our William Greaves Research and Development Fund for mid-career filmmakers. And we produce digital short films like the forthcoming series In the Making, presented with PBS American Masters, and another series, Homegrown Future Visions, presented with PBS Digital Studios and the Center for Asian American Media. Firelight Media's Beyond Resilience series is supported in part by Open Society Foundations, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, and the New York City Council, the National Endowment for the Arts, and Field of Vision. Our programs are also supported by our generous community of Firelighters, individual donors who provide vital monetary support and encouragement that directly benefits our programs and our operations. You can donate to Firelight Media right now by clicking the link in the chat or by texting the word Firelight, F-I-R-E-L-I-G-H-T, to 44321. That number again is 44321, the word Firelight. You can also support Firelight by hitting the subscribe button below on YouTube. Click the notifications button to be alerted about future episodes of Beyond Resilience, of which there will be many in the coming year. Now I'd like to introduce the moderator for today's discussion, Kareem Ahmad. Kareem is a writer, culture strategist, and organizer. He is the founder of Restoring the Future, a network of culture workers using world building and industry organizing to build a more just and beautiful media arts system. Kareem is also the creator of the Muslim Futures Project, a cross-platform anthology of stories set in radically aspirational Muslim futures, and the writer of the speculative fiction graphic novel Divide. He was the creator and showrunner of the groundbreaking science fiction series Future States and is a member of the Guild of Future Architects. Welcome, Kareem.
Thank you, Marcia, for the very, very warm welcome. As always, it's always just such an honor to be here with you and with the whole Firelight fam here at Beyond Resilience. As Marcia said, my name's Kareem Ahmed. I use he and they pronouns. I'm calling in from the unceded land of the Tongva and Chumash tribal nations. I'm grateful to them for allowing me to be here to do this work with all of you. I'm a Pakistani man with medium brown complexion, salt and pepper hair, and I'm wearing a black sweater in front of a pretty boring white wall, unfortunately. I'm really, really grateful to be here to guide what I know all of us feel like is a really vital and what a lot of us also feel like is a long overdue conversation. Over the last few years, our field has seen more than its fill of films that, upon examination by the field, have been revealed to demonstrate unethical filmmaking practices, an absence of duty of care practices in place to safeguard protagonists, and too often the perpetuation of really deeply harmful stereotypes about the communities at the center of the story. And while simultaneously, coalitions of organizers and organizations have led our field in the development and adoption of just immensely more ethical and accountable ways of working, harmful and extractive filmmaking practices continue, probably to the surprise of no one. Yet, for these films to harm communities that they document, they also must be programmed. And in the act of curation, an institution that holds power and prestige, it signals to its peers and to its audiences that this depiction of a community has value and that it's worthy of proliferation. And this is a really tremendous responsibility. And the more visible the platform, the greater that responsibility becomes and the greater the potential harm. So over the years, we've seen cultural institutions overlook that responsibility, but we've also seen leaders in the field of film curation uphold and uplift these responsibilities and advance those responsibilities and practices and develop ethical values and practices in curation, and as we speak are charting the course forward to a just and beautiful future for film programming. Over the last year, I've had the privilege and the pleasure to be in conversation with many of those leaders as part of a curatorial justice project that's been conducted by the Restoring the Future Collective, that has been graciously supported by the Perspective Fund and the Ford Foundation and Open Society Foundations, and in partnership with over 50 leading programmers and festivals to gather and synthesize their curatorial practices into a report that will function as a field-wide resource and toolkit for values-aligned organizations in the field. I'm incredibly excited just to be here with all of our participants here who all participated in the creation of this report and are leading the field in film programming in their various sectors and ways to talk about their work, their practices, and their visions for an ethical and abundant future of film programming. So before we go any further, let me introduce the panel that we've assembled for this conversation. Lucy Jane Mukherjee is a queer British Indian film curator and programming disruptor dedicated to elevating the careers and underestimated storytellers. In 2018, Lucy co-founded the Programmers of Color Collective, a global professional development group for BIPOC film curators at festivals around the world. Welcome, Lucy. Pleasure to have you here. Elijah McKinnon is an award-winning strategist, entrepreneur, and visionary from the future, currently residing on planet Earth. They are the co-founder and executive director of Emmy-nominated web TV platform and nonprofit Open Television, also known as OTV. They officially have the best bio ever. Nihad Khader is a festival director at Black Star Film Festival and a curator, editor, and writer whose work in film informs her work as a historian and vice versa. Trained in media and literature by Black and Palestinian creators, Nihad is moved by art that carries aesthetic excellence as well as social and political significance. Welcome, Nihad. Welcome, everyone. I'm really excited to have this conversation with all of you, and I feel like there's just so immensely much that we need to and could pack into the short time that we have here. So let's just jump right in. Nihad, I'd like to start with you, actually. As one of the leading film festivals in the country focusing on Black, Brown, and Indigenous creators worldwide, I'm hoping we can start with you giving us a bit of a field scan over the course of the 12 plus years that Black Star has been doing this work. I'd love to hear you speak to just kind of the state of the field or the culture or community or the industry at the time of Black Star's origination that led to the necessity of the organization and the festival to begin its work. And also how that sort of carried through the history and how that affects the way that you program the festival. From sort of artistic vision and programming values of the festival and ways that they might be sort of a really sort of unique in the field. Trying to sort of build out a sense of just like, what are you building with Black Star, and sort of what is the need in the field that you're looking to address through its creation and evolution over the years?
Thank you so much, Kareem, and thank you to Firelight for bringing us together. And I guess I just want to start by saying that we'll probably really only begin to scratch the surface of this conversation, and that I come to it with really deep humility and a lot more questions than anything else. So Black Star was founded in 2012 in Philadelphia. And Maori Carmel Holmes founded it. And, she often says that at the time, there weren't a lot of venues that were inviting or screening the incredible works that were out there by Black creators. And so that's sort of the genesis for Black Star Film Festival, but what's today now Black Star Projects, which is more than the festival. The festival's in its 12th year, but we also now have a podcast and a journal and a seminar and a lot of other things to sort of bring the work of Black, Indigenous, and Brown creators to each other and to audiences. And so that's sort of that beginning has really shaped the way that we do our work. I think after the first year, the team of organizers realized that people were finding, in fact, by the second year, really by the third and fourth year, we were finding that folks were meeting their producers at the festival, were meeting, future collaborators of all sorts, their protagonists, the stars in their films, funders, cinematographers. And so it sort of informally started to be called the family reunion. And I think we're really lucky and privileged in the types of films that we have gotten to screen over the years, and the type of communities that we've been able to build. I think we can stop there so that others can also.
Thanks, Nihad. Lucy, you have a really rich career at a variety of film festivals of different kinds and different scopes and scales and focuses. And some of them are, have been run by larger institutions, and some function in, more of a community rooted kind of way. And I'm curious, with that breadth and depth of experience, what's your personal philosophy around curation, and how does that manifest in terms of some of the practices that you've tried to advance, and then also just if you feel so inclined, other practices that you've seen in your experience in the field that you're inspired by?
I think my approach to programming is always evolving, because I'm constantly soaking up knowledge from my peers and my colleagues and learning how other people in this field are solving issues and challenges. But I tend to have a trio of guiding principles that I apply to my work. So that would be programming inclusion, authentic authorship, and impact. When it comes to programming inclusion, that applies to on-screen, on-staff, and on-stage. So constantly being vigilant about who's missing from every conversation and giving voice to the people who have been left at the margins. Authentic authorship is truth in storytelling. Who's telling the story? Why? Is it theirs to tell? I subscribe to the nothing about us without us model when it comes to curation. So I'm most interested in the films that are made by the community that the film is about. But I've found that this continues to be seen as a radical concept. I look forward to the day that it becomes like industry standard and is applied to all funding and programming assessment criteria. And then impact is sort of twofold. It's the effect of the content on the audience. How do you want them to feel when the end credit rolls? And what do the community need right now? What I'm hearing lately over and over again is that we want hope, we want joy, we want escape in our content. And with that in mind, I won't play work that shows violence against LGBTQ people, for example, or anything that centers on shame or recycles other tropes like that. So I'm always asking filmmakers to think bigger, dream bigger, imagine better. And I think also about the impact after the screening, and that's sort of the cultural strategy piece of programming. How does this film create a conversation or a movement? How does it expand society's perception of a particular event or identity? And how does it empower us to imagine new possibilities?
Lucy, I love the way that you talk about impact. And one of the things that particularly resonates with me is just sort of the way that you sort of speak about how does a community want to be represented on screen. And, you know, I'd love to hear, if you don't mind me following up on that a little bit more around sort of like the ways that you, in your experience, have navigated that, because that feels so much at the heart of a lot of the sort of questions of curation that we sort of started with. So I'd love to hear you just talk a little bit about sort of how in your practices you've tried to navigate that.
Sure. It's not easy, right? Because in this work, we're often, especially as programmers of color, we're often sort of outnumbered on the team, and often we don't have sort of job stability. And so when we're expressing opinions or instincts, we're often going up against authority and potentially like putting our jobs in jeopardy, and potentially wouldn't be invited back the following year because we're seen as troublemakers. But I think it's a matter of tying the organizational values to the films that you're assessing and being very careful and mindful about, you know, what work you're putting forward. So when it comes to queer representation or trans representation, thinking about the legacy of cinematic representations of these identities and how can we evolve beyond those historic tropes versus recycling the same stories over and over again. And it's difficult because we're sometimes confined within the limitations of the submissions, the films that have been made that year, the films that are available to us. But it's often as much about endorsing work that we believe in as it is about blocking work that we don't want to endorse. So it's sort of, that's a part of the job that I think a lot of people don't really think about. The work that's going to do harm, we don't want to get behind. And there are, of course, situations where festival leadership will sort of overrule programming teams and insert films that we wouldn't ordinarily have selected ourselves. And that creates a really awkward dynamic that I'm constantly seeing again and again at all the festivals that I've worked for.
There's a lot in what you just said, Lucy, that I want to come back to you later. But first, I want to go to Elijah, because I think it's important that we sort of think about curation and programming sort of beyond just the lens of film festivals. And I think that the work that you've built and advanced and grown with OTV, I think, is a really unique example of ways to sort of think about curation in a different way, because these considerations around being more community rooted in terms of programming practices and justice centered in terms of curation that begin with film festivals have really far reaching implications when applied to wider distribution. And so when considering positive or negative impact that mass distribution platforms can have on communities by either recycling harmful tropes or by centering the experience of a community in a way that they don't want to be seen, like we were just discussing, the stakes get even higher. And so I'd love to just hear you, Elijah, speak a little bit about OTV's curatorial model, how you're selecting artists and projects to support through the programs that you're running, because I think the model of the organization is so unique in that there are so many different ways that you're supporting individual artists and also creating infrastructure in the field. And so I'd like to hear you talk a little about sort of what was the need in the field that resulted in the creation of OTV, and what are your goals in terms of kind of rebalancing the marketplace in the industry and culture at large?
Oh, I love these questions. Hello world, Elijah McKinnon here. I use they, them pronouns. And yeah, I'm also coming to this conversation with a lot of humility. I think definitely coming with a lot more questions than answers, but I think from the perspective of OTV, which is a nonprofit streaming platform and media incubator for intersectional storytelling, we've always, from our inception in 2015, created and approached this work from, artists and their creative visions at the center. And I think what we mean by at the center is, really relying heavily on the communities that we are cultivating to tell us what they need and not to prescribe them what market or society is deeming to be in trend or, to be a model that is centered and anchored in, capitalist ideals. And so for us at OTV, I think we're slowly developing a world where media is a tool for building empathy over division. And so we are coming to this work in our model around a practice that is rooted not only in artist development, but in community development, right? Because we need to not only center and anchor our work around developing artists and churning out the next and best project, but also a community of individuals that, want to support them beyond their success, right? And want to be there for them when, the market, right, and society and industry fails them. And so there's so much about this industry that is rooted in smoke and mirrors effect, right? Where it's like, look at what this hand is doing while this hand is doing this other thing. And I feel deeply grateful for the people that I get to work with and the community and artists that we support, because brick by brick, this organization is laying that necessary foundation to not only identify and activate and mobilize the next generation of storytellers, but also to cultivate space for them to be unafraid, right? To embrace cultural differences or, feel empowered to navigate these really complex systems that were not designed for them. And for me, that's the honor that I come to this work with. And, as it relates to our model, I just feel, let's just be honest, we're an all Black, queer, and trans-led team of people coming to this work as artists, right? As people who have been harmed by this system. And, we are not interested in perpetuating that, right? We're not interested in perpetuating those systems that we know don't serve us. And so everything that we do is coming from a center or a continuum of care. And it's more of our priority to support artists and their trajectory versus, what we can gain from them, right? Or what is something that is commodifiable. And that to me is what is so interesting about film. And so much of what I love is that there's just so many ways to enter it. And I think that's a great place to pause.
Thanks, Elijah. I think maybe it's useful just to kind of level set for a little bit. And I'd love to hear from anyone, just so that our audience kind of understands sort of what we're talking about and what you all in your experience feel needs to be changed about the field of curation and film programming. I'd love for anyone just to sort of speak about, what are you feeling that the practices are that exist that need to be changed, or things that you were trying to build in terms of new practices in the field through your work?
I can speak a little bit to what we're trying to build. Again, like part of the privilege that I come from is that we get to program the way we want, which is really nice. And so I think a part of the way that we've always been curating is sort of this intentional politic around internationalism. In sort of the old sense of the word. So if we consider ourselves to be the global majority rather than the way that in sort of the United States we posit or folks posit ourselves as minorities, which we're not. And so that is sort of like a really empowering perspective to come from in terms of curation. I think, to be honest, then that internationalism, it sort of invites us to program work that is coming from a lot of different perspectives. And we also are, majority North American. And so that comes with its own set of very real political privileges and very real political blind spots as well. And so I think in terms of curating, everybody is open to making curatorial mistakes, to not seeing everything that we should be seeing. Sometimes a film, especially in documentary filmmaking, seems like for all of these reasons and all of these ways that we can think of in this moment, it seems like it doesn't do the harm that we think, a documentary film could do. And then after the fact, some new conversation erupts that in fact, maybe there has been some harm done. And so, this is where I think programming in community as a practice moving forward is imperative and really important. So I think that's sort of one contribution that I'll give is this idea of programming in community and inviting a lot of different voices to participate in any given sort of curatorial practice.
Thanks, Nihad. Anyone else? Lucy?
I can jump in. Yeah. I think there is a common practice of bringing programmers on at the last minute and paying them little or nothing at all. And so not investing in the staff is really problematic, bringing them on board last minute, cutting them off as soon as the festival is over. So moving away from that model of sort of generally white people holding the year-round permanent jobs and the queer, Black and brown people being thrown the seasonal crumbs. I'd like to see that change. I'm also astonished, this has to be said, but for festival founders, like putting films that you worked on, your own films, into the festival is a conflict of interest. Can we just say that here? I'm seeing that a lot, and it's something that happens time and time again. But I think when festival founders, festival leadership, they don't ask sort of their programming team's opinion or feedback on a film and want to go ahead and invite it without a conversation, you're essentially turning your programming team into window dressing, and they're there to make you look good, but you don't want to hear their point of view in case it contradicts your worldview. That's really problematic. But there's a lot going on in the field right now. I think we can't mention it all here, but that scratches the surface a little bit.
I'm so happy that you both kind of went in this direction. I think from the OTV side, we're by technical definition, right, a distributor, right, because we have an app and we're bringing these stories to a common space for people to watch on demand. And I think something that I'm really proud of, and I believe through the leadership of Sarah Minnie, who is our head of artist development, and Chris Walker, who is our head of marketing exhibition, they've really cultivated a way for us to define a language on how we talk about the content that people bring to us, where it's rooted in us focusing in on, yes, the story, but the artist. I think there's so much that happens in the film industry that, spills over into various understandings and definitions that may not be shared. And for us, what we have learned to talk about, especially as we look at, film through an intersectional lens, we're trying to build an ecosystem, right, that makes people feel empowered, even if, we're not distributing their content, right? And we're not, able to provide them the space that they're looking for on this particular platform. And I think for me, what I love so much about the way that they're approaching that work is through this language. And the language is even thinking about how we, quote unquote, reject people, right? Or how we even cultivate spaces to continue people's journeys. I think for me, one thing that this industry as a whole, and a variety of the intersections that are within it, is taking true inventory on how we're in such a disposable culture, right? And for us, what I love is that, if you're coming to us because we are quite niche, and we like that, we like playing in that space of like, you had a friend that had a friend that told a friend, and then, you found your way here. But I think what I admire is that we now have it sort of baked in our culture and in our language that no one is disposable. And so when we are embraced with content that pushes up against our values, we have vocabulary for it, right? We can isolate that particular experience without separating it from the artist or separating it from the story. And we can bring that into the conversation without diminishing the work or without platforming it in any way. And that, to me, I think is just something that I've learned when we talk about development, right? That's the key piece, right? Is sticking with it, right? And understanding that that language is going to change, right? There are new ways to approach this work every day, and it's up for us, you know, as people in these leadership positions and in these places of privilege, to learn that language and not, or potentially do as the least amount of harm, right, with this privilege and access that we have.
Thank you for that, Elijah. Excuse me. I want to take a minute just to encourage the audience to ask any burning questions that you might have by dropping them into the chat on YouTube as you're watching. We'll have a little section as we get towards the end for Q&A, so definitely feel free to drop anything that's really you're really puzzling over, you really want to get the panel to speak on. Definitely drop that in. I'm really grateful for all of our panelists kind of framing your perspectives the way that you did. I feel like a lot of the things that I'm hearing are just like a continued sort of reinforcement of care and community engagement and humility being so much a part of your practice. And it really resonates, I think, with a lot of the conversations that we've had with curators over the last several months. And I think, one of the things that's become really clear is that as many curators and programmers want to be engaging more deeply and more thoughtfully and take the time to really think through what are potential ramifications within a community of a particular story being told, that, no organization has the time or resources necessary to conduct a really lengthy, robust investigation into the thousands of films that are submitted, and few can even really effectively vet, even a much smaller array of films that are competitive for final programming slots. And that, I think, I just want to undergird something that Lucy, you had mentioned earlier, because I feel like that, makes it clear that like sort of questions around reforming practices and values in programming in the future is really not just an individual institutional problem, but we're really sort of talking about systemic conditions that exist in the field, in which, in order to sort of reboot or rebalance the way that practices and values are manifest, it's really a question also of ways that philanthropy and corporate sponsors and other funders of this work are more effectively able to resource festivals and other curatorial bodies to really support the enhancement of that kind of community engagement and sort of ethical investigation. And underlining also something else that you have mentioned, that continues not just to deepen investigations of the communities that are having their stories told about them, but also the communities that are actually curating and building the festival, really underlining that idea that you mentioned, Lucy, that sort of care of the folks and care for the folks that are doing this work is really critical and also needs to be resourced institutionally and systemically in terms of the way that y'all are doing your work. Most importantly, though, too, I want to underline something, Nihad, that you said, which is, the humility in your approach, and that everyone, I think, has mentioned. It just really clarifies that I think it's important to recognize that no matter how much due diligence any programming team implements, that, there's always the possibility that mistakes are going to be made. That's inevitable. And so, the other side of this is that processes for harm reduction or engagement with community and reparations is also a big part of this conversation also. And, notions of accountability in the filmmaking industry are obviously not new and have been well designed and progressed by, a lot of folks in the field, like the Doc Accountability Working Group and Detroit Narrative Agency and a lot of others, as it regards reorienting the relationship between community and filmmaker. But those same concepts of harm reduction also carry through to the relationship between a programmer or a programming institution and the community, and which I think is a cultural shift and a shift in values that I think you all are manifesting in your work, but it's certainly not a universal thing. I think that underscores a little bit of the way that there's a little bit of an accountability problem across our field, in that it's something that very few organizations are willing to do. And I don't know if anyone wants to sort of speak to why that might be the case, or any other sort of like broader sort of systemic conditions that you feel you would want to highlight that are maybe making it more difficult to proliferate some of the practices and values that you all are cultivating, whether those are sort of market pressures, commercial pressures. I'd love to hear all of you sort of speak to maybe some of those considerations that you may be seeing systemically that make it difficult institutionally for individuals to do work in advancing the kinds of practices that we've been talking about.
I'd love to jump in here if I can. I think that festival leaders often have this sort of instinct to be seen as the first or the biggest or the best festival in their particular city or demographic. But if you have not built the infrastructure to support that claim, if you have not invested in paying your filmmakers a screening fee, paying your staff a living wage, then I think we need to stop that sort of self-congratulatory messaging. But the pressures that a lot of festivals are experiencing are things like, festival programmers are experiencing are things like, our worth being assessed by how many films we've watched that season, how many world premieres we've brought in, and then after the festival, how many of the films that we recommended were well reviewed by critics, acquired by distributors, nominated for awards. So it's sort of tied up in these festivals' need to want to stay relevant or to appear as if they're relevant. And I think that's kind of a dangerous tension that comes into play when you're just wanting to show good work.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I can speak to just the broader context around, I think it's a brilliant question as to like, what are some of the barriers to, I think, like a larger community understanding how to approach this work from, a space of accountability when what I have learned about specifically the film industry as a whole is how much of a secret / understanding it is that so much of the industry is rooted in some of these really toxic behaviors, and how okay it can be as long as the work is getting completed, or as long as we're hitting, as Lucy said, some of these quotas or goals. And one thing I want people on this this space to really leave with is that approaching this work through a lens of equity and justice and transformation is not easy, right? Because the entire system is actually against that. So I don't want to glamorize like this idea of like, we should all be accountable and we should all, yes, we should do that. I definitely agree that we should. And I think that there are ways in which we can do it. But I think before we begin even that conversation, we really have to look inward and understand what are the systems that we are up against, right? And how are they designed specifically to keep you so debilitated, right, from accessing this type of transformation that we want. And there are so many resources and so many spaces that I think are starting to have this conversation. Kareem, you're a part of many of those spaces, and I think it's so important, right, for us to continue having that understanding, but we can't approach it from a space, I think, of like, well, everyone should just blanket do this, right? Because that won't work. That doesn't also solve it. And I think I want to leave that there, because I think sometimes when we start to throw words around, it can feel a little daunting and a little challenging to actually access.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think it's important. Nihad, is there anything that you would want to add on this? How are you thinking about the systemic factors at play?
Yeah, no, I feel like I want to almost complicate everything, because in addition to the systems we're up against, there's also the systems that we're a part of. And one of the things that I was thinking about is in terms of programming, one of the things that, you can't sort of is difficult to break from is the type of competition that inevitably gets created within sort of, having a festival at all, and showcasing work. And so that's also, part of that is the constraint of time. It's like when you have 5 days and you have 12 hours within every day to be able, there is literally like a time constraint that you have where you can't show everything that you want to show. You can't show everything, and you can't even show everything you want to show. There's actually a limit. And so again, this is like me coming to this with a lot of questions rather than a lot of answers. But even in a situation where, you're paying screening fees, you're paying programmers well, you're giving your employees a living wage, all of that, there are still things that we're participating in, inevitably. And as, for example, any given festival grows, then you have more submissions and you're still limited with the amount of time that you have dedicated to a film program. And so you can't increase the number of films that you accept with the number of films that get submitted. And so that is sort of another issue, and I think a way in which inevitably we're sort of participating in creating a type of competition that you don't necessarily want to create for these filmmakers that you love, the communities that you love, that you and the work that you really want to showcase and present and show. And so again, this is where I keep saying I'm coming at this with a lot more sort of to open many more questions than I have answers. And that's sort of, that systemic of time, but then, then there's also capitalism, which is an even bigger thing. And then there's labor, which is another, so there's a lot of parts of this to unpack.
I appreciate you framing that that way, Nihad. And I think there's a lot in kind of what you were saying also that sort of points to just a little bit of sort of like your vision, even for all of the questions, I still see like, sort of your vision for some of the values that you would center in kind of the future of the field. And I'm curious from either of our other panelists, if you'd want to sort of manifest in the room some of the values that you would sort of center in the future of the practice of film programming from either your sectors or field wide.
So many. One that comes to mind is really investing in meaningful relationships with the grassroots groups that are in your backyard. Don't call them 2 weeks before the festival with a $2 ticket discount. That's kind of standard practice, and that's really a shame. So like be partners year round with the groups that surround you, because those are your audience members, those are your creatives. And so find out what those stakeholders want and need and figure out how you can use your festival to address those things.
That's great. Elijah, what are the values that are at the center of your vision for the future of film programming?
Many. Definitely not all of them can be shared today, but I think, coming off of this really meditative state and something that has been at the top of mind across sort of time and space is like together and through. I think that so much of filmmaking in all of its regards from all ends, including oftentimes programming, can be done in isolation and can feel very much like you're on an island. And I've been coming back to this idea about together and through is how we get free. And so whatever that freedom looks like, to you or the communities that you represent or, the spaces that you are programming to come into fruition, I feel doing that with people who are in alignment with you and can also hold you accountable to what you have set is something that is just rocking my core right now as I am learning and growing and evolving, is that there are people around me that are like, hey, do you remember who you are? and I think the more that we can anchor ourselves in that towards this work and have people around us the freer we will be.
Thank you for that. I love that. I'm going to go into some audience questions here. I think there's a lot of questions that I'm seeing here. Sorry about that. There's a lot of questions that I'm seeing here that are sort of in the space of the ways that festivals are working with distributors. And so I think, I would love to have each of you actually sort of speak about the way that, whether if you've worked at festivals, various festivals, how they've approached the relationship with commercial distributors, or Elijah, for you, I'd love to hear sort of the way that you're engaging with other distributors in the field, and just sort of whether or not that is sort of, or just how you navigate that pathway in terms of deciding what to program and how to program.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here. I think what's really interesting and that I often find is a red flag is that, and I mean, Kareem, you know this, but for many of you watching out here, we at OTV have non-exclusive distribution agreements with all of our artists, meaning that we actually encourage you to enter into secondary, tertiary agreements with other places, because the more visibility you get, the better chances you are at having your dreams come true, whatever that means for you. And so I think in these spaces with other distributors, that becomes a threat I've witnessed, right? I've witnessed that space. But with programmers, it's actually become a really beautiful relationship where they're starting to understand how artist development can look a lot less like ownership and a lot more like a relationship or a partnership that is constantly evolving and changing and growing. And so it is something that we at OTV are investing more time in as we build relationships with festivals, and we build more relationships with programmers at the festivals who, have, certain understandings of what artists are looking for, right, after they've exhibited their content.
I'd say Black Star is sort of in the process of building out our work around distribution and with distributors. And I guess as far as kind of ownership over films goes, we don't require necessarily a premiere. So for us, we're sort of really happy to think about programming in the sense of, what we're programming and the conversations that we're creating and, what we're bringing to our audience. We really sort of center our audience as well as our filmmakers. But I also wanted to say, I didn't get to answer the question about values, and I wanted to name access as a really important value moving forward in the future of not just film festivals, but I think all art exhibition spaces. And that's access in terms of disability justice, access in terms of language access in terms of geography, and all of those things seem like a really important value for us, all of us, moving forward.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Neha. I think the distributor conversation is sort of two-sided. From the programming side, for the festivals that require world premieres, there's going into it, you have the intention that you're programming a slate of films that will become the content that gets acquired that year and will get to the streamers and will be out in sort of public consciousness for the next couple of years to come. And so there's the sense of the festival as part of the wider ecosystem and that they feed the distributors. But that comes with sort of a double-edged sword, which is that then the distributors also have an expectation that festivals will hold slots for them, will sort of insert films at their whim without having to be sort of part of the evaluation process or considered on the same level as all the other films that have been submitted. just sort of get into the front row or at the front of the line. Yeah, so it's complicated.
Thanks, everyone. There's another question here, and I think this might be the last question we get to before we wrap. Specifically around, and I think this speaks a little bit to, I think there's a couple of questions around folks wanting to wondering sort of what grassroots alternatives might exist to film festivals for filmmakers who are more interested in their films being seen by what this person refers to as frontline communities, as opposed to sort of being in sort of more of an art or film world. And I think this, maybe to broaden this a little bit, it might be useful to sort of just for each of you to speak about the ways in which, or I guess, who is the audience at your respective film festivals, and what are the ways that you're trying to balance audience base amongst, you know, frontline communities, as this person refers to it, versus sort of like more in an art space? How are you thinking about the makeup of your audience, and what would you recommend for filmmakers that are trying to broaden that audience beyond the traditional art film world?
So I think the work of folks who do impact campaign tends to be really great for bringing films to frontline communities, or, you know, to the front lines, or and I think that in most places today, there are those kinds of, I mean, and I think there's always been libraries, and there's always been, centers that host these sorts of places, but it really feels like the work of impact campaigners to do that sort of really incredible work of bringing the film to the audience that you want. And then as far as the Black Star audience is, I feel like it's a really it's not a Philadelphia audience anymore. It's sort of like a geographically diverse audience now. It's folks who are coming even from outside of the country sometimes. We think about young people. We try to program for children. We try to program for families. And it's also an audience that is filmmaker rich. So it's sort of a really incredible mix, primarily people of color. And so part of programming for the Black Star audience, we're also thinking about wellness components. And, if we're showing a really important film, but that might be triggering, we think about, like, how do we present this film? How do we offer the resources that folks need before and after the film to be able to experience it, especially after the pandemic, with, folks being indoors for so long, and just asking people to trust us to come together, to step into a dark room and see something. We do think a lot about who's in the space and how to make it comfortable and welcoming for as many people as possible.
I can jump in here. I think this is actually a question that I've been wrestling with myself. And I've been thinking a lot about how independent curators can step in to sort of fill that gap where festivals are falling short. So I don't know the answer. I know that the festival experiences that I've had that have continued to feed me have been those really engaged audiences that have stayed for Q&A conversations that are almost as long as the film screening itself. And those are wonderful, warm, empowering moments that make me realize that there is a need for these convenings to connect artists with audiences. But I don't know if the festival model is the solution, or if there's room for something else. But I would really love to see more value put on sort of the culture shapers, the movement builders, as like the people to do that work. And I think that means it has to be outside of the festival space, without the pressures of brands and sponsors and board members and all of that.
Thank you, Lucy. Elijah, do you have any final thoughts for us on this before we close?
I think that they both have hit it, on the head. I think what I would just add in closing around this particular topic is really just getting to know who that audience is and defining it, right? Who are those frontline workers? How do you find them? Are you in community with them? Because so often I've found myself asking, like, where are the people? Where are the people? But I'm not actually asking for the people, right? I'm not asking for the people that I'm looking for. And they just so happen to be, next to me or around me or within my reach. And so that's something that often comes up. And, oftentimes that's not happening, maybe as, Lucy just shared, in the festival space where there's so many constraints, but outside of it, there is an abundant world full of opportunity.
That's such a beautiful and perfect note to end on. It's almost as if you planned it that way, Elijah. That is our session. I just want to thank everyone for joining. I want to extend a ton of gratitude to our panelists, Lucy, Elijah, and Nihad, for joining us today. Big thanks to our co-presenters for their thought partnership on this series. That includes the Minasa Advisory Group, Brown Girls Doc Mafia, Color Congress, and Working Films. And thanks everyone for tuning in, for sending your questions, and especially for wanting to build a stronger future for film programming. So please look for links in the chat for more information about the panelists, the work that they're doing, the Beyond Resilience series at large. A huge thanks to everyone at the Beyond Resilience team and the Firelight fam as a whole. And as always, you can learn more about Firelight's work by visiting firelightmedia.tv. So thank you all. Stay safe, be well. Bye-bye.